Welcome to the Butchertown neighborhood. Butchertown neighborhood's been here since about the 1840s when subdividing began in this area. This is Louisville growing upstream from downtown. When you think about the Butchertown neighborhood, think of East Main, Melwood toward the Ohio River. That kind of summarizes where the Butchertown neighborhood is. You know, the Butchertown neighborhood came here in the 1840s as a subdividing process. It was German butchers, German meat processors who settled in this area very, very early. It was called Butchertown because so many of the Germans that settled here were butchers or pork packers or operated slaughterhouses or meat operations and related industries in some way. You know what they found attractive about this neighborhood? When you're in the meat business, the farmers need a place to meet the buyers. And so the Butchertown neighborhood was really originally at Louisville's front door, one of Louisville's main front doors. For you see, the turnpike that came from Shelbyville and Frankfort, the Bluegrass area, the turnpike literally came into the Butchertown neighborhood, and farmers driving animals to market began to develop relationships here where there were industries that grew up in the meat packing and the meat processing industry. So we were on Louisville's front door coming from the Bluegrass. Another thing that made Butchertown attractive was that many of those German butchers and meat packers created their slaughterhouses literally in their backyard. And you know what was in their backyard? Beargrass Creek. Beargrass Creek drains much of the eastern and central part of Jefferson County. Well, that creek formed the southern, the eastern, and the northern boundary for the neighborhood. So the German meat packers and butchers and slaughterhouse operators, they literally had their operation backed up against the creek, where they drained the refuse from the killing house floor directly into the creek. So that made the neighborhood attractive. Now, already I've suggested to you that residence and work closely entwined is part of what made this neighborhood click. Or to say it another way, the owners of the slaughterhouses and the packing houses, they lived adjacent to their laborers, and everybody walked to work because residence and work were clearly intermingled in this neighborhood. Now that's good news, bad news, because after World War II, it seems that work, meaning industry and commerce, impinged on residents, so much so that between 1960 and 1980, there was over a 50% reduction in the number of houses in the Butchertown neighborhood. And you will see areas where work, that is commerce and industry, has pushed up too close to neighbors in this area. So residence and work are closely intertwined. The rich folks and the poor folks lived very close together, and they all had a chance to walk to work. Two other characteristics of this neighborhood. One is you will see that this neighborhood has been carved up over time. In the 1880s by a railroad track, and by railroad overpasses and railroad trestles. In the 1960s by superhighways, in the 1940s by flood wall. So the Butchertown neighborhood is kind of carved into pieces, and you will feel as we walk along moving from one piece to another. And a final characteristic, we're going to be walking on streets, many of which are named for people that you've heard of. For instance, we're now standing on Adams Street. The next street north is Quincy Street. Just behind you is George Washington Street. So there are plenty of streets that are named for people you've heard of. Now, this house here dates from the 1840s. John M. Letterly, I'm never sure whether it's John M. Sr. or John M. Jr. built this house. You're going to hear the name again, so don't get nervous. This was the Letterly house, built in the 1840s. Obviously, it has been Victorianized, in order to make an office. It looks like the front door is not there anymore, but this house here on Adams Street dates from the 1840s. It's called the Letterly Rim House. Now, down at the corner here is an interesting street. It's Old Maiden Lane. Now we call it East Washington. It is said it's called Maiden Lane because the Diamond District of Manhattan in New York City was around Maiden Lane, and somehow or another this street's name got associated with that wealth and prominence. I'll tell you what Maiden Lane used to have. It had pork packers, some of which had houses that backed up against what was then Beargrass Creek. But more importantly, on Maiden Lane was the Maiden Lane Colored School. There were African Americans in pockets, in zones all around the Butchertown neighborhood. And from about just before 1900 until the 1950s, the late 1950s, Maiden Lane Colored School was up there. But after 1911, you're going to know it as Benjamin Banneker Colored Elementary School. Benjamin Banneker? He was that Revolutionary War era African American from Maryland who was a scientist, a surveyor. He had worked with L'Enfant in designing the street plan for Washington, D.C., and L'Enfant got mad and walked off the job, left it to Benjamin Banneker to finish the work. So this was the Benjamin Banneker Colored Elementary School here on East Washington, formerly Maiden Lane. Come on down here on Adams Street. Now remember, I told you that the Butchertown neighborhood had been carved up. Here's the flood wall of the 1940s that has literally been built down the middle of Quincy Street. Houses on one side, houses on the other. All of them solid residential structures, but divided by a flood wall built down the middle of the street. Now, would you look? That car is headed downhill into the old bed of Beargrass Creek. Remember I said Beargrass Creek was on the south, the east, and the north. It was on the north side until 1854, 1855. The creek had become an open sewer and it emptied into downtown Louisville, forming the north boundary of Butchertown, just in front of where the Belle of Louisville now sits. That blood-stained creek full of stench was emptying in downtown Louisville. Plus, we needed more wharf space, so in 1854-55, we erased Beargrass Creek. But the lowland survived. Watch it. That lowland will be used for city dumps and private dumps all along this area for block after block. That lowland will be used for railroad tracks. That lowland will be used in modern times for an interstate highway. Come on, let's head to Washington Street. Lovely bungalows, solid houses, pride in residence in the Butchertown neighborhood as we move along. And over on the corner was the old Gnaw, that's G-N-A-U, Gnaw grocery store. They were both retail and also in a little bit of the wholesale and supply business for many, many years, but that's the old Gnaw grocery store on the corner over there.
Oh, walk on now.
Now, as we head down Washington Street, we're going to see an alley, and there aren't many left like this, that's not asphalt, that's not brick, but is stone. Listen, you're going to hear the clippity-clop of firehouse horses coming up the alley. And here's the firehouse. For you see, the stables for the firehouse were in the rear. I know I'm about to wear you out with the name, the John M. Letterly Firehouse. Engine Company Number 10, 1873. Operated here from 1873 to 1925. Some of you may know that Don Allen had an interior design shop here, but the firehouse with the name J.M. Letterly way up at the top, this was the city firehouse, and the horses were drawn from the stables in the back. Now this massive complex on the other side of the street, this is St. Joseph's Catholic Church. St. Joseph's Catholic Church was founded in this neighborhood in 1866. They began in a church classroom kind of combination for the parish school, but then in 1883, according to the cornerstone, these predominantly German Catholics, finding success in the Butchertown neighborhood, built this Gothic church. Classic Gothic form with the tallest church steeples in Louisville at 75 feet. First, when the church was built, finished in 1885, they only had one steeple. But then they added another steeple in 1905. And they say one steeple is taller than the other? I'm never sure. I look and it's an optical illusion. I never can tell. But nevertheless, this is the twin spires of St. Joseph, mostly German Catholic Church in the early days. There's Jesus being held by Father Joseph. When we come around to the side of the church, notice that there's even a Christian cross that's been embodied into the shingles of the church roof. This side of East Washington Street has numerous solid single-family and duplex Camelback shotguns. These lovely homes, solid brick, have what is called a Camelback, a two-story addition in the rear. Now, you know, we still struggle with where we got the idea of the shotgun house, but these shotgun houses, long, narrow bungalows, in this case, at least in the front, probably came from West Africa with slaves. You find them in Haiti, you find them in New Orleans, you find them along the Ohio Valley where slavery existed. You don't find them in Cleveland. You don't find them in Chicago. These are shotgun houses, beautiful, beautiful in design. We're approaching Daniel Webster Street. I talked about the mingling of residence and work. 1870, this was a factory building, a furniture factory, a silver and beveling factory. But this factory building since 1870 was best known in this neighborhood as Hellmuller's Bakery. The ovens are still inside. The stables are still in the rear where the horse-drawn bakery delivery wagons were housed. And it became, in the late 1960s, early 70s, Bakery Square. The famous restaurant that was there was called The Stable, because it was housed in the courtyard of the stable and in the stable itself. Would you look at this? I did say Butchertown neighborhood, didn't I? Actually, I wanted to make that an original piece of decorative equipment. When I was reconnoitering for this tour, I saw the neighbor owner. He said, I bought that steer head at an antique shop in Paris, France, but it seemed to fit the neighborhood so well, I brought it here and put it on the front of my house. And doesn't it? This intersection at Cable and Washington, you don't need to know who Cable is, but I'll tell you anyway. He was the Virginia Assemblyman in 1776, when this was not Kentucky, but part of Virginia. There was one gigantic Virginia county that reached all the way out this way beyond the Allegheny Mountains. It was called Fincastle, and Representative Cable sponsored the legislation to divide Fincastle County into pieces, and one of those pieces was called Kentucky County, and that's why this is called Cable Street. Over where you see the trucks and you see the fence, That's an education center historically. The German immigrants had a private school, the German American School, right over there facing Cable Street in the 1850s. By 1866, the public school had come to that site. It was called First Ward School. In fact, in the old school building, there's a medallion at the very top, kind of in a top knot, and it says First Ward School, 1866. Later, it was named George Washington Elementary. During racial segregation, it was for whites only, but George Washington Elementary School sat there for 100 years, 1866 to 1966. Now, up here on Cable at the intersection, this is going to be a main drag to that area that was beyond the old bed of Beargrass Creek. Look, the street slopes downward into the old creek bed. And where you see in the far distance the interstate highway and maybe a car or two passing, that land is a little bit higher. You know what that piece of land beyond the old bed of the creek toward the river is called? It's called the Point, because when the old creek was there was a dagger-shaped piece of land that reached with the creek on the south side, the river on the north side, and it tapered into the Ohio River right in front of where the Belle of Louisville now sits. That piece of land is called the Point. There were hundreds of houses on the Point. 1937, 1945 floods so devastated the Point that there are only 2 houses left. Neither of them occupied. You know why the first house on the Point isn't occupied? Because all that exists is the front of the house. That's called the Christian Heigold House. Christian Heigold was a German immigrant in the 1850s, a time of terrible political tension. But Heigold himself was proud of being an American, and he was a stonemason, a stone cutter. And he built his house over at Marion and Lloyd Street on the Point. Remember that, Marion and Lloyd. And he used the front of his house as a billboard. He made the bust of George Washington and wrote in stone on the front of the house a praise of George Washington. He had President Buchanan on the front of the house. He had his wife on the front of the house. He had stars from the American flag. He said, "Hail to Louisville" on the front of his house. But by the 1940s, the city dump was literally falling into the Heigold House's yard. And Mayor Charles Farnsley asked that the house, the front of the house, be saved. They dismantled the stone front piece by piece, numbered it, and reassembled it in Thurston Park over on the Point. So there's the Christian Heigold House. The other house sits idle. It's called the Pageant House. Dates from that era when the Point was a shady grove of relaxation for folks from New Orleans in the early 1800s coming to get cool from New Orleans. The Pageant House was built in the early 1800s. It was enlarged in 1837 by a distant ancestor of George Washington. That house sits there idle. The hope is that as new housing is built on the Point around the municipal boat harbor, that both the Heigold House facade and the Pageant House will be incorporated into that new development. Now over here, opposite the school, was a gigantic cotton mill. Now they were making rope, cotton rope, hemp rope, and it was called the Puritan Cartage Mill. You know what they did for the students at George Washington Elementary School across the street? They supplied them with endless numbers of jump ropes for the playground. Free! Remember, the Butchertown neighborhood over the centuries got carved into pieces. This piece was created in the 1880s by a railroad track that's going to be leading to a passenger and ultimately freight station on Water Street down in downtown Louisville. So this became a railroad corridor with an industrial zone gathered around the railroad corridor. So we are going to cross the tracks and go into the western piece of Butchertown that's called Buckeye. I don't know why it's called Buckeye. I just know that for many years, over on Main Street, right at the edge of the neighborhood, there was a Buckeye Tavern. But I have a feeling that the name dates for some reason long ago, and I don't know. You know what? Truth of the matter is, doing this kind of neighborhood history, every time you peel back news, an answer, it reveals even more mystery, more questions to be asked, more questions to be answered. But we're going to step into the Buckeye section of Butchertown, and except for the name of the tavern, I don't know why it was called Buckeye. As we cross the railroad track, we're going to be crossing Pocahontas Street. Now, on your left, I spoke of the ancillary industries. How about if the farmers are going to come to town to sell their pigs and cows, might they want to buy some fertilizer and seed? I'd guess so. Might they want to buy some farm implements? But all of these things are part of that meeting of farmer with processors and markets and suppliers. But this area on your left, for many, many years, well into the 20th century, was a zone of African American residents. African American apartments and tenements were on both sides of the street, and right in the center of this block on the left where you see the wooden fence was the St. John's Baptist Church, an African American congregation. I bet you've wondered. A lot of Germans, African Americans. You telling me there weren't any Irish in Butchertown? I think so. Maybe that's where Buckeye got its name, that this was more an Irish sector. But I can tell you, the Irish Catholic Church stood right there, just about where that second tree is. It was founded here in the Butchertown neighborhood in the 1870s. It had a separate elementary, a parish school, until 1920. It was first called St. Columba, and then a new parish in West Louisville took that name, and it became known as Blessed Sacrament, Church of the Blessed Sacrament. Well, at least this railroad track that existed here had the courtesy to go overhead on these pylons right here. There was an overhead trestle that came across Story Avenue and heads to the Big Four Bridge. The Big Four Bridge is that bridge that stands without approaches today, but this is where the trestles for the approaches, one of the approaches to the Big Four Bridge that came up and over the Buckeye section of the Butchertown neighborhood. And today in the Butchertown neighborhood, meat providers, Dryden Provision, just one of the continuing industries that reminds us of Butchertown's heritage. The sign says no outlet now, but this alley really went somewhere. It went to John W. Story's house and carpentry shop. John W. Story gave its name to Story Avenue that we'll see here in a little bit. But John W. Story was a civic leader, lived over on East Main, and he was a civic leader, a carpenter, a builder. And so he was an important person in the late 19th century here in the Butchertown neighborhood, and this is the way you accessed the shops for his business. Here's the old Pearson, P-I-E-R-S-O-N, neighborhood grocery and dry goods store. Good morning. How are you? Good to see you. Been a long time. Now I know you're going to ask me who Wenzel was, and I swear I don't have any idea. I just have never figured out who Wenzel for Wenzel Street is. On a hot morning, why don't we just walk along this tree-lined promenade? Because this will allow you to get up close to the several interesting houses, well maintained and well kept here in the Butchertown neighborhood. We'll be able to see them up close. But don't miss the left-hand side of the street either. There are solid, good houses there as well. But notice, right in the middle of the block, there is commercial development that has impinged off of Main Street here on East Washington. Again, that tension between residence and work. There was a time when Butchertown was running down at the heels. And this house reminds us of the efforts of the Butchertown Incorporated. In the early 1960s, citizens and some business folks got together to try to build residence and new life into the Butchertown neighborhood. One of their earliest projects, using proceeds from the old Butchertown Oktoberfest, was to buy these two deteriorated houses and to bring them together as a remodeled and redone structure with two units, one on each side. And so this is an example of that preservation effort that Butchertown Inc. did in the early 1960s. Rich folks, poor folks. This is the formidable home from at least the 1880s, although there is a marker on the building that suggests a construction much earlier. A house built first by a quarry owner and then a stonemason. But nevertheless, throughout the late 19th and into the 20th century, David Frantz, F-R-A-N-T-Z, German name, was a tanner. And this was his big house with a formidable carriage house to the rear. So this was the David Frantz home. I did say tanner, taking animal hides from the slaughterhouses and turning them into finished leather. So there were a lot of tanneries as ancillary industries in the Butchertown neighborhood. We're at John Campbell Street. John Campbell was one of the founders of Louisville. He was an early landowner proprietor involved in Louisville's very earliest beginnings. Over on the other corner is just one of the multiple corner grocery stores that existed in this walking neighborhood. That neighborhood grocery was run for decades by the Jacobs family. It later became the Butchertown Market. It is frequently used in commercials to evoke images of the walking neighborhoods of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. This neighborhood grocery store is still kicking in the Butchertown neighborhood.
Bravo, Tom.
In the row of brick houses on the south side of the street, there's one that I especially find interesting, and that is the squeeze me in between the two houses next door brick house, clearly just squeezed in on a very narrow and tight lot. It doesn't surprise you that at the turn of the last century, right at 1900, the settlement house movement was very important in communities in America, with many immigrant populations moving and crowding into the city. Do-gooders began to provide social services of all kinds. Well, this was a settlement house. This was the Methodist Settlement House, named for John Wesley, the Wesley Community Center, it is now called. It began over in the Phoenix Hill neighborhood, east downtown, moved to these giant mansions in 1925. The one on the corner, the smaller of the two, was owned by a wealthy man who was a livestock commission merchant at the stockyards. The house here at 805, the larger of the two houses incorporated into the Wesley Community Center, it was owned by a banker. He held all of these roles. He was a banker, a lumber yard owner, a police chief. He was a person of standing in the community, and here was his house.
Oh, pick it now.
Well, he was 19 years old, you all. Thomas Edison is said to have lived here. We know he lived on Washington Street. We know he was working as an apprentice telegraph operator for Western Union downtown. And this house museum celebrates Edison in Louisville and celebrates the contributions to science that Thomas Edison made. That flood wall that you're passing through, she's now 29 miles long. Sometimes she's an earthen levee. Sometimes she's flood wall with gate slots, just like you see across Franklin Street. She runs from the top of the Butchertown neighborhood all the way through downtown, Portland, Shawnee, Chickasaw, headed all the way into Southwest County and ends up almost West Point on South Dixie. That's to hold the river back. Franklin Street is a delightful street to take a leisurely walk down. The houses are of brick and frame, bungalow, federal style, Victorian, just a mix of residents here on Franklin Street.
Oh, walk on now.
We've seen it throughout the neighborhood, but this was the old OHLMAN, Ullman Family Corner Grocery. And in living memory, this building on the left at 901 was a tavern, a restaurant, or an inn, local eating establishment here in the neighborhood. The old city directories indicate that Driesbach, it's a German-sounding name, I guess. Driesbach, the grocer, was in that corner building. Over on the other corner at 938 is the Franklin Street Baptist Church. They began in the middle of the block in the 1880s. By the late 20s, they had moved down here to the corner and erected this building in 1931. As we cross Wenzel Street, be sure to step lightly because you're crossing the light rail line. Part of Louisville's interurban system went to far-flung Jefferson County suburbs. Well, this is the light rail coming out of downtown. Oh, it's gone now, but it's coming through Wenzel Street and headed up onto the Big Four Bridge to head for Jeffersonville with a branch line that went to Charlestown, Indiana. So this is the route of the approach of the interurban up to the Big Four Bridge. This is Jenny Reichert Park. Jenny Reichert was one of those enthusiastic neighborhood leaders in the 60s who were involved in the Butchertown Renaissance. Behind me, the flood wall splits Franklin Street. Let's head down the right side. This massive old industrial site was the site originally of David Friend's, the big house over on Washington Street. This is where he had his tannery for processing animal hides. Now, by right at 1900, this had become the Dow Wire Works. They had moved from downtown Louisville. You know what they did? They made wire screen door guards and other kinds of finished thin metal pieces. By 1925, one of the employees who had become president of the company bought it out and gave the company his name. It was called the Logan Company. Hume Logan, you know the name? He owned that elegant Civil War era home that is now Whitehall on Lexington Road. So this was Logan Manufacturing, once had 800 employees. They made mattresses, bed springs, they made fire escapes, and they got involved in the conveyor business. In fact, there is a Logan product still sold by the successor company that's out off of Poplar Level Road. But this was Logan's. Well, we've turned now onto John W. Story Avenue, named for that Butchertown neighborhood carpenter, builder, and civic leader. Now, over on the other side of the street, we see some features that we need to know about. First, you can see the brick building with the ornamentation in stone on top. That's the 1869 headquarters for the massive, we say, the South's largest stockyards. The animals were driven, trucked, or railed to the Bourbon stockyards. If they were driven, they came along Story Avenue, which was at one time called Cattle Barren Road. It was also called Beargrass, also called East Main. But nevertheless, this was the main turnpike from Lexington into Bluegrass. And there at the end is the Bourbon Stockyards. It closed right at 2001. The old stockyard pens are occupied by the Home of the Innocents, and the old Stockyards building is used by the Stockyards Bank, which makes perfectly good sense. Notice the lay of the land, tapering off into the creek bed. That's where the Middle Fork and the South Fork of Beargrass Creek have already come together and start forming in that valley there, the southern side, the southern end of the Butchertown neighborhood. On Bickle Street, on that site over there, was one of the many packing houses in the neighborhood. That was Wissmann, German name. Wissmann Pork Packing was on that site there. This was the site of a lumber yard. Across the railroad track, where today Armour Packing employs hundreds of employees in the meat processing business, that was the old Emmert Packing Company. And now Armour uses the site of Emmert and the site of Wissmann, earlier pork packers in the neighborhood, for their operations in modern times. Old lumber yard on this site historically. When I mentioned that the Bourbon Stockyards had been at that site where the brick building with the ornamentation on top is, that's since 1869. The Bourbon Stockyards dates back to 1834. You know why? Because right here in the 1300 block of Story Avenue, there used to be a small hotel on the turnpike. It was called the Bourbon House Hotel. And hog drovers, moving their hogs to market in the city, would stop here last night on the road at the Bourbon House Hotel. The enterprising hotel owner knew the interest of those drovers staying all night, made makeshift pig pens out behind the hotel. And it wasn't long before there was an informal buying and selling and trading out behind the Bourbon House Hotel, and by 1834 it had been transformed into the original site of the Bourbon Stockyards. So this was the original site of the Bourbon Stockyards. Now the giant red brick building opposite the Armour Packing Company, the old site of Emmert's, That was the National Oak Leather Company. Leather Company? Yep. It was owned by Andrew Cowan. Andrew Cowan was one of the founders of the Louisville Park System, was involved in lining up Frederick Law Olmsted's firm to come to lay out the park plan for Louisville. So that was Andrew Cowan's National Oak Leather Company, and Louisville was known all across the country for doing fine saddles, bridles, and harnesses. And that's just one of the places where they did it. This was the site of John F. Ertle's 92 Brewing Company. It had begun as the Butchertown Brewery. John F. Ertle became involved in the business, and we believe by 1892, or was that the nation's centennial? Is that why he gave 92 to his beer? But we think in 1892, he became involved as owning the brewery, and Ertle's 92 cream beer became the trademark made there at Ertle's. So this is just the warehouse and the bottling works for the old Ertle's 92. I brought you over here, we've crossed to the south side of Story Avenue, to show you in faint, faded lettering on the building, it still says Bottling Works for the John F. Ertle Brewery. Behind me stood the massive 1900 brew house and administrative headquarters for the Ertle Brewery. She had turrets and towers. She had a tap room in the basement if you needed to stop by for a brewski. This was the massive headquarters and brew house for the Ertle Brewery. It was torn down in about 1970. The neighborhood negotiated for the new business that went in here. This is the Medical Center Laundry. Over on the other side of Story Avenue, here at Webster Street, that's the old Meyer drugstore. You might have known it at a later time as the Butchertown Pub. This commercial corridor along Story Avenue served the neighborhood along what you would call the main drag. Streetcar lines going in two directions, two-way traffic. This was probably the most alive center of commerce in the Butchertown neighborhood. True. Some of the larger homes in Butchertown were up on Story Avenue. This formidable residence served for many decades in the late 1900s as the headquarters for the Louisville Jaycees. Next door, in the vacant lot, was the home of Gottlieb Layer. Gottlieb Layer was a major operator of a slaughterhouse and a meat packing industry. In fact, his gigantic home stood here from the 1880s, and it is a tragedy to have lost it. It had decorative mantelpieces, it had beautifully decorated woodwork inside. The Gottlieb Layer's uptown home, you know what was in the backyard? A slaughterhouse with pig pens run by Layer himself and later his son, pig pens, and even a cold storage building for meat processing. So again, in the case of the Layer home, upscale living and working with beef and pork in the backyard.
Oh, pick it now.
So the next incision in the neighborhood comes in the late 1950s, 1960s. there was a massive organization to prevent I-64 from going through Seneca and Cherokee Park, an organization called Save Our Parks. But in the 1960s, there was not an organization that said Save Our Butchertown, because this massive interstate incision separates a middle piece of Butchertown with an eastern or an upper piece of Butchertown. It was on this site where the Great Western Pork House was. And next to it was the Bluegrass Distilling Company. I only tell you this because of the night in August of 1890 when the Bluegrass Distillery caught fire and the flames raged into the animal pens of the Great Western Packing Company next door. And the conflagration burned up over 1 million barrels of whiskey. The stories tell us that barrels of flaming whiskey were blasted into the sky. The whiskey rolled downhill to the rear into Beargrass Creek and caught the creek itself on fire. The massive fire of August of 1890 at Great Western Packing and starting at the Bluegrass Distillery on this site here. The community, to soften your stroll underneath the expressway, has painted murals. The mural on your right is the historic mural, the old Letterly Firehouse, and the drover driving pigs down the turnpike to market, and some pigs being chased by a butcher, and only to pull up short when the little piglet sees that there's a special on pork chops. Look over yon, Hadley Pottery Company, but read the sign coming down in faded letters, Simple Manufacturing. They were manufacturers of mops, of all kinds of cotton products. Simple Manufacturing. But they weren't the first folks to be there. There had been a candle factory there. That industrial building, we believe, dates back to the 1850s, and it is said was the first industry in Louisville that was electrified in its manufacturing process. This is the old Simple Manufacturing Company. But in 1944, Mary Alice, read that M.A. Hadley, and her husband George came from the old Louisville neighborhood and moved to Butchertown with their new pottery works. And so this became Hadley Pottery. As we walk along, you'll see many of M.A. Hadley's designs that have been embedded in the sidewalk. Why, there's a piglet himself, herself, and a chicken, and a bunny rabbit. That massive hole in the ground that reaches all the way down Story Avenue to Frankfort Avenue on the corner, that hole in the ground was occupied from the 1870s forward by the Kentucky Woolen Works, a woolen mill. They wove fabric for clothing, and later there were major clothing factories on that site. Later it was used as the first site for the Oktoberfest, the festival that was held here in Butchertown for so many years. Now we're at the intersection of Story and Frankfort Avenue. Over on the corner is Kirchner's Cafe, still in letters on the side of the wall. Before that, it was Russia's. It's been a grocery store. That old building with the stone footings for the foundation was an anchor here at the corner of the main entrance to Louisville from the Bluegrass, because it was on this turnpike, now Frankfort Avenue, that drovers, travelers came across that early 1797 bridge that brought you across the creek onto Story Avenue. The turnpike turned left and went into the heart of Louisville. Jefferson County gave permission to Frederick Geiger in 1797 to build the bridge. Oh, it's a newer one now, but it's still an old bridge. Build the bridge on that site across the deep, deep Beargrass Creek Valley. That contract was given to the man who built the house on the hill. Frederick Geiger in 1797 built a formidable rural residence. Frederick Geiger had a mill on the creek, one of Jefferson County's earliest mills. He had land holdings that went all the way to the Ohio River. He operated a landing there for the movement of freight onto the shore and onto riverboats. He operated an Ohio River ferry that crossed the river. Frederick Geiger's house is still sitting here on the hill, the oldest house in the Butchertown neighborhood. A person in 1850 by the name of Louis Rhem, R-H-E-M, bought the house and made it even bigger. Today, 19 rooms in the Geiger house on the hill. This street here was called Rhem Avenue, R-H-E-M, for the later owner of the house on the hill. It's now called Blue Horse Avenue because George Hadley, the pottery artist husband, not only was involved in selling his wife's pottery through Hadley Pottery, but George Hadley operated Blue Horse Motors over on Story that overlooked the old Rhem Avenue. So the city renamed the street for George Hadley's sports car business, both sales and repair, which was called Blue Horse Motor because one of Mary Alice's patterns was the Blue Horse. So this is called Blue Horse Alley or Blue Horse Avenue. The residents of the Butchertown neighborhood were an enterprising lot. Remember that the refuse from the killing house floor, the slaughterhouses, the packing houses, was drained directly into this Beargrass Creek. Well, the hog killing season was November to March, and the residents of the Butchertown neighborhood made makeshift dams across this creek at 50-foot intervals. The blood from the killing house floor flowed freely through the dams, but the grease congealed and rose to the top and collected behind the dam. So the residents waded into this icy water with a bucket in one hand and a ladle in the other and ladled off the grease and took it home and rendered it into soap and candles as a cottage industry. The Courier-Journal in December of 1869 said, and I quote, "Yesterday, hundreds of Butchertown residents were fishing grease out of Beargrass Creek." Congregation dates from the 1880s in the Butchertown neighborhood. They moved here just after the turn of the century. It was the third, and this is interesting in light of the German immigration to the neighborhood, the third English-speaking Lutheran church. It later became part of the Evangelical and Reform, and now United Church of Christ tradition. But this is the quaint neighborhood church that's been here as a congregation since the 1880s. And here in the sidewalk is Mary Alice Hadley's Blue Horse. Well, why would that be? Well, this house has had a succession of uses. For the first decades of the 20th century, it was an orphanage. And then later, Mary Alice Hadley had a gallery here where she sold some of her work. It was a little gallery. And then the Art Association of Louisville was here at one time. But this old house on Story Avenue reminds us of the multiple uses, but Mary Alice's Blue Horse persists here on the sidewalk. This is where George and Mary Alice Hadley lived. This house was owned by the Hadleys for many, many, many years. And then before that, it belonged to a pork packer by the name of Conrad. I would say that some of the larger, more expensive homes are on this upper east end of the Butchertown neighborhood. This was the last chance in until 1900. Once the Brownsboro Turnpike had been extended by way of a narrow one-lane bridge across Beargrass Creek, then you have yet another turnpike coming into the neighborhood, and this was the Last Chance Tavern. Last chance to get a shot of whiskey before leaving town. Bill Fisher is a Louisville artist. He's now in his 80s. He came here to the Butchertown neighborhood in the early 1970s, and he's been doing painting here ever since. His house is a historic home. He believes that it was originally built, at least on the front, there was a large single room that wouldn't have been a bedroom, wouldn't have been a living room. He believes that it was an early inn or overnight tavern where you could stay on the turnpike. But nevertheless, this house is a historic home and an art gallery where he exhibits some of his paintings. The handsome, sometimes Victorian, sometimes Federal style, sometimes 3 stories, sometimes single bungalows, all the way down the north side of Story Avenue are very, 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 very solid. But remember, this whole neighborhood has been reconfigured because just behind these houses is a gigantic earthen levee, part of the beginning of the flood wall. So this whole neighborhood, this whole part of the neighborhood to the north has been substantially reconfigured in the rear by the flood wall that's there. There's one historical image that I just alluded to briefly, and maybe this is the time to tell you about it. I mentioned that in the old bed of Beargrass Creek that was erased, but nevertheless the low water standing slough remained, the old path on the north side of the neighborhood, just beyond what's now the flood wall. I mentioned that that area, that low-lying area, has seen some pretty rough use. Not only did slaughterhouses drain directly into the old low-lying land, but more importantly, beginning, I believe, in the late 1800s, but certainly into the 1900s, a 5-block portion of that area just to the north here, no more than a block north of here, began the evolving of both private and public dumps. The largest city dump, especially growing more rapidly after the 1930s when there were consolidation of smaller neighborhood city dumps. And in those days, I swear, a dump was not a landfill. It was daily raw garbage piled on a mountain. And let me tell you something, with a public dump for 3 blocks on the north side and Grady Dunn's private dump that went all the way from Adams down to Cable. With those 2 massive dumps on the north side, there were significant problems that reached well into the 1950s. The dump would catch fire with acrid smoke from a smoldering fire for days and days in the summertime. There would be vermin, smells, horrible stenches, and gigantic rats. I shot rats on the old city dump off of Ohio Street. The private dump, the issues persisted well into the 1950s because in the 40s, the city dump to the north right here began adopting a little more daily cover, daily landfill kinds of methods. Certainly wasn't a sanitary landfill, but daily cover. So they would try to cover the raw garbage with a little dirt every evening to hold down the smell and the stench and the vermin. But Grady Dunn, who owned the private dump to the west, did not go along, and his dump persisted as a massive public health issue. Mayor Wilson Wyatt in 1944 went to see him on a visitation to see the horrible conditions on his dump. Did you know he had 13 families living on his dump, and they were garbage pickers. They didn't get a dime's worth of pay. They got to live in their cardboard and wooden crate houses free. Oh, thank you very much, Grady. In addition to that, when they would bring recyclables that they would scavenger off the dump, then he would pay them in vouchers redeemable at a local grocery store. So they got a place to live and some food, but no pay on Grady Dunn's dump. Well, the mayor came to see him to talk about the horrible conditions. Grady had pigs grazing on his dump, fattening themselves on the raw garbage. Mayor Wilson Wyatt said, "Mr. Dunn, you're going to have to get rid of these pigs. This is horrible." And he said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I will. Yes, sir, I will." But rumors that there were pigs still on Dunn's dump. The mayor went back for a second visit, went up to Mr. Dunn and said, "Mr. Dunn, the pigs on this dump have not gone." He said to the mayor, "Oh, yeah, they have. They're gone. These are different pigs." The complex behind me was in the late 1800s at least, and well into at least 1920, where there was a big fire. But this was Stucker's Tannery to the rear. There was a tannery back there where they were processing animal hides. They used the bark of trees in order to give color to the leather. And so there was a gigantic tan bark. You know, tan bark is what you throw down in a beer garden to let you walk and keep getting your feet muddy. Tan bark. And so there was a gigantic tan bark mountain back where Stucker's Tannery was. And kids, I'm not sure this is healthy, kids used to slide down the mountain of tan bark that was outside Stucker's Tannery. But down this narrow driveway, do you see the blue building at the rear? We believe that the first floor stone portion of that building, that was A. Klug's, K-L-U-G's, soap making factory. Back at the rear, back where the blue building was, there was the alley where the tannery was. It was called Stucker's Alley, or also Lost Alley. Why it was called Lost Alley, I don't know. But that we believe is the old soap making factory, A. Klug, and this is the Stucker home here at 1633. The White House, that was owned by Minnie Perryman. You may know her as Min. Min's East End Cafe was next door for many, many years. Well, Min Perryman lived next door and operated the East End Cafe, many people know it as Min's, for many, many years here in the neighborhood. Well, the mural on the south side of the expressway overpass is traditional, historic Butchertown. The mural on the north side is contemporary Butchertown. And you can see the Home for the Innocents, you can see the former Don Allen Gallery, you can see the various buildings and their more contemporary use. Do you know what the Courier-Journal says in the newspaper box? It's telling. It says, Butchertown Renaissance. Story Avenue Playground and Park's been here since 1913. In 1951, right adjacent to the Story Avenue Park, on the park land, the Optimist opened up a boys club. It's now the East End Boys and Girls Club, and it's been here since 1951 as a recreation and social service provider here in the neighborhood.
Oh, welcome, man.
Teresa and George Jurgel operated a dry goods store on this site for over a half century. They had begun in a little deeply set off the street cottage with their dry goods store, and then they moved to this more formidable building here. But this is one of the old landmarks here in Butchertown, the Jurgel Dry Goods Store building. Well, you remember I talked all about these corner neighborhood mom and pop groceries. Well, by the 1930s at least, a major chain store had come to the Butchertown neighborhood. This is the A&P, the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. This is the supermarket of the 1930s in the Butchertown neighborhood. That alleyway there, you know what it's called? It's called Bowles Alley, B-O-W-L-E-S. You know why? Because the owners of the old Butchertown market in the 1970s down at Campbell in Washington, where Jerry's is now, the corner grocery store. They were powerhouses in Butchertown, Inc. and the Butchertown neighborhood renaissance. And so the city renamed the alley for the Bulls, who had been so helpful to the Butchertown neighborhood.
Going on home, Tom.
Well, folks, you've been troopers. You're survivors of this Butchertown walk. Remember, this neighborhood with grid-patterned streets that moved up the Ohio River from downtown Louisville, sort of an extension of downtown, north of Melwood, sort of at the head of Main Street. This neighborhood of the 1840s was peopled in the early days by a whole lot of Germans, and many of them were butchers and packers and slaughterhouse operators. They were attracted to this neighborhood because Frankfort Avenue, turning left onto Story, was one of the city's main turnpike front doors. It brought drovers driving animals from farms in the bluegrass all the way to markets here. And Butchertown evolved as a place where farmers with their produce and their livestock met markets and processors and suppliers. And you have seen it. From slaughterhouses to pork houses to tallow and candle factories to pork rendering plants to seed and fertilizer suppliers to modern day packing houses and modern day hide dealers and processors. All of this is part of the Butchertown heritage and the tradition. But you know, one of the main things that made this neighborhood attractive, this turnpike neighborhood attractive to German butchers and meat processors, was Beargrass Creek was on the south, the east, and the north, and that became an open sewer for draining the refuse off the killing house floor. Even after 1854, when they drained Beargrass Creek to the north, but it remained a slough where dumps and refuse and industries ended up being located. The other thing about this neighborhood that we can remember is that it has been sliced into parts by railroad tracks, by overhead aerial tramways, by interstate highways, and by a zigzagging flood wall. And we have walked on streets named for people that you have heard of. But you know, I've talked about Germans. We know also the Irish to the west, and the pockets of African-American residents in this neighborhood as well from the earliest days. So this neighborhood is a neighborhood where residents and work historically have been intertwined. They still are, and we have seen moments where industry and commerce have impinged too tightly on residential districts. But nevertheless, this vital Butchertown Renaissance neighborhood is part of the lively neighborhood fabric of our city and is something to celebrate. Thank you very much for walking this Butchertown neighborhood walk with me.